one quick. It's our first one. Okay, I think we're about ready to begin. So welcome everybody. Thanks for interrupting your morning or getting up early to come and join us today. I'm Ryan Heath, author of the Playbook column at Politico, and this is the latest in our Playbook Breakfast series. And so obviously there's a couple of hundred people in the room, but I also want to welcome the more than 1,000 that are watching via the live stream right now. And so with us in the hot seat for the interview today is Vice President Jyrki Katainen from the European Commission. He's Vice President for Jobs, for Growth, for Investment, and for Competitiveness. So he's one of the part-time commissioners, obviously. But before we get into that, I've got a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll have a few words from our sponsor, EY. So first of all, please do get some questions ready. We try and make it as interactive as possible. I've got some questions from Twitter that I'll be peppering into the interview. And if you just introduce yourselves via your name and anyone that you're representing before you ask your question. So the Vice President has got a grip on what's about to hit him. And then you are obviously encouraged to tweet during the breakfast. So that's with the hashtag #PlaybookBreakfast. And then at the end, and we take this very seriously, there are evaluation forms. Politico really emphasizes being an audience-driven publication and media outlet. So we want to know what we're doing right, what we could be doing better, or what we did wrong. So fill them out with full honesty, and we'll make the events better as we go forward. Now, I think I would like to invite our sponsor up on the stage. So without EY, we wouldn't be having this conversation here and the great breakfast that you've had and the coffee you'll have afterwards. And so I would like to invite up Alessandro Cenderello, who is the managing partner for the EU institutions at EY.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ryan, for the introduction. EY is honored to welcome you at this event, at this breakfast event with Vice President Katainen today, and I'm personally looking forward to listening to what promises to be a very interesting interview. So why it is important for EY, why we decided to sponsor this initiative today, and the reason is simple. We consider that this is a very challenging time for Europe, and we believe it is vital as an organization to support the agenda of Vice President Katainen around jobs, growth, investment, and competitiveness. I think it's very important to show support and commitment also as EY around these priorities. Because we want to use our global reach and scale to convene the conversation about these challenges that the economies are facing, to build trust and confidence in the capital markets for the benefits of our clients, of our communities, to create a better working world, as we say at EY. For us, a better working world is a world in which trust increases, capital markets are strong, investors make informed decisions, business grows sustainably, and employment rises. I think that these themes are especially important for Europe today. They are important in general for the global economy, but especially for Europe, because unemployment stays high in our continent, above pre-crisis level, and globally, according to the numbers of the International Labour Organization, we will have to create additional 280 million jobs over the next 4 years if we want to just to provide employment for the new entrants to the labour market. So this is posing, in our view, huge challenges, internal and external challenges to Europe, and a lot of pressure on our politicians. and especially because we are still facing very low nominal growth. Deflation is still high. Unemployment, as I said, is persisting in many member states. So clearly, monetary policy alone cannot solve all our problems. In an interview of more than 1 year ago, Vice President Katainen, when you were launching the investment plan for Europe, you said that investment is truly a golden thread that waves together everything that we do. So we fully support these statements and the decision to include the improvement of the investment and capital rising environment as one of the pillars of the investment plan for Europe. Regarding to this, I would like to make 3 statements that I'm sure will also resonate on during the interview. The first one is that we believe that entrepreneurship and innovation are more than ever crucial for Europe. So as EY, we are honored to play an active role in advising, guiding, and recognizing the world's leading entrepreneurs over the last 3 decades. So our experience in this respect is long and deep. Since the financial crisis, governments around the world have realized that you can only achieve long-term sustainable growth with a vibrant and flourishing entrepreneurial ecosystem. So US is often cited as having the most entrepreneurial culture on earth. And we see this reflected on the tracking that we do of the venture capital funding. So last year, US-based companies raised more than 5 times their European counterparts. So we think really that building a diversified financial ecosystem that operates through a Europe-wide capital market and a strengthened framework for alternative investment looks like an essential requirement for any growth-friendly agenda, and especially for Europe. The second point I wanted to make is that growth is indeed now faster than ever. Hypergrowth companies and startups that reach 1 billion valuations within 10 years, the so-called unicorns, used to be very rare in the past, but are becoming common in the global enterprise landscape. And this is what is interesting is that this is not only just a Silicon Valley phenomenon. Of course, US still leads in producing hypergrowth companies, but for instance, if you look at Europe, Sweden is the 3rd largest producer of unicorns after US and China. So this is a very interesting phenomenon. And the second point, the question I wanted to ask is what we need to do to further encourage this high growth activity in Europe. We think that few companies, especially SMEs, still face major difficulties when attempting to scale their innovative solution and cross-national borders to enter new markets and plug into international value chains. So administrative, regulatory, and legal barriers are hampering the scaling up of innovative SMEs and should be removed in Europe if we want to exploit the full potential of our market. My last remark is about the business case for circular economy, and this is a point that I am personally very close to. We think that the ever-present demand for innovation, sustainability, and social inclusion creates a significant long-term opportunity for high-impact entrepreneurs, corporations, and government working together to transition toward innovative products and services for consumers and citizens. From this perspective, our experience shows that circular economy can represent a substantial opportunity for economic growth across several sectors if and only if, first of all, paired with the transformative power of digital technologies, especially the IoT, the Internet of Things, and the digital assets, and if the right market incentives and policy frameworks are put in place. So having said that, I think my job is done for this morning, and I'm looking forward to taking my place and leaving the floor to the interview. Thank you so much.
Okay, we'll get straight into it. I've got a question based on what you might have been up to last night, Mr. Vice President. Now, the EPP, the party group that you're from, was having a dialogue event down in Saint-Jury. Did you go along to that event?
Oh yes, it's very important to find all the aspects which will generate growth and which will create new business opportunities. We also have to find the right incentives for entrepreneurs, and I very much share the view of the previous speaker that it's partially the growth is hampering partially because of lack of risk financing, but also and even more importantly because of regulatory obstacles. Yep. And that's why we have to look at those regulatory obstacles both in national level and in European level. So the best thing to stimulate economies to do structural reforms in national level, but also to create new market as we are doing as a Commission to deepening and widening internal market, for instance, digital single market or capital markets union or circular economy. I very much like that you raised particularly circular economy because it will be the next mega trend in the world economy.
Yeah. And do you think, in terms of, for example, structural reforms, so President Juncker, he appointed a Director General just to look at structural reforms, but he's now been sucked into the migration and refugee deal and crisis over in Greece, Martin Vavayan. Do you feel like we're doing enough on structural reforms? Because I look at Europe sort of trying to be a bit distanced, a bit objective as a journalist, and I feel like there's a lot of governments that just don't really get what structural reform is, let alone have the political will and capital to ram it through in a time when populists are setting a lot of the agenda. So do you think we're going far enough on structural reform?
No, unfortunately. If I should mention one single issue which is holding back investments and the one single issue which is the reason for lower economic growth than what we all would like to expect, it's the old-fashioned or outdated societal structures. Yep. The world around Europe has changed, the market around Europe has changed, and we are challenged by Chinese companies, by American companies, by any other companies from different parts of the world, and our societies have not been reformed. Having said this, what reform means, it doesn't mean that we have to lower our social standards. It doesn't mean that we should lower our environmental standards. It doesn't mean that we should compete with the lowest possible salary level, for instance, with Chinese factories. But what it means reforms to education system. 1/5 of adults in Europe have significant difficulties in their literature. Can you imagine 1/5 of European population, adult population, have significant problems with their literature? This is something which shows clearly that we need structural reforms. We have to pay attention to the quality of teachers' training. We have to pay attention to the quality of education, more generally speaking. And of course, we have to reform labor market in the countries where it doesn't function perfectly. So we need to boost reforms in national level. So I come from the country which is very generous welfare society. I am a side of a very generous welfare society where education is rather good, where social benefits and social security, healthcare is pretty good, and everything is not free, but it's free of charge.
The economy is also not growing.
Yeah,
so I agree,
that's right. At the moment,
yeah. But
Finland is a typical example of the country which has benefited about liberal, market-oriented mindset together with strong, robust, inclusive social model. And now the country is in a situation where it must be reformed again because market around Finland has changed. So that is the reason, that is the reason why the Commission is putting more emphasis to the structural side of our national economies. We have been very strict with fiscal rules, which is very right. Less strict with structural reforms. And now it's last time to shift the focus a little bit towards the direction of structural reforms.
Because I do detect, and I'm not saying you're responsible, but I detect that partially there's a bit more flexibility, a bit more softening on that fiscal side. If you look at the budgets of Portugal, Italy, France, sort of the usual suspects who are demanding that flexibility. But in a way, you're saying part of that deal is you get a bit more flexibility on the budget, but we're going to be tougher on the structural reform.
Exactly. Exactly. I very much agree what Mario Draghi has said over and over again, that when the central bank is doing their job, they have very accommodative monetary policy. In return, they expect member states to do structural reforms in order to improve the external competitiveness. Because the lack of competitiveness is our main problem at the moment. So the good and the best possible external competitiveness is the best friend of welfare society. So you can only earn enough money to run welfare society if you are competitive enough. And competitiveness doesn't mean, this is a misunderstanding in many political discussions, it doesn't mean that you have to lower the standards. You have to reform.
But it's a tough debate. I mean, the next Playbook event will be a cocktail with Emmanuel Macron.
Yeah.
And he's someone who's very popular abroad. Like, people think he's doing the things that France needs to sort of catch up to speed with some of the better performing economies, but he hits a brick wall at home. And when he hits that brick wall, unemployment stays above that 10% level.
I think Minister Macron knows exactly what must be done in France. I have done, in my previous life, in national level, I have cut the budget, I have raised taxes. But it's much easier than reform, for instance, pension system. So it's a universal phenomenon. If you ask people to work one additional year, I mean, if you want to do pension reform, which would enable or which would say that you have to work 1 or 2 more years, it's far more difficult to do than cut a budget or raise taxes. People accept lower income merely than work 1 or 2 more years. It doesn't make any sense, but it seems to be the same everywhere. Also, if you try to reduce a number of municipalities or regions in order to streamline public administration, it's very, very difficult. People accept budgetary cuttings merely than structural reforms.
So we're not going to get one police force and one administration in Brussels then?
Okay, it's
we'll just get higher taxes. I think
Yeah.
that's where we're headed here. And in a way, I mean, if you look at all of that work around the structural reforms, I'm not reducing it to merely technical work, but in a way it's kind of anti-populist work. It's trying to figure out what really works and looking at things sort of a step back from the deep politics that sometimes get played out.
Yeah.
But we're operating in an environment where populists are really on the rise, and I wanted to ask you about something Donald Tusk said last night, and I'll share it with you because I'm imagining you weren't staying up late to read Donald Tusk's speech. But it's about populists and how they're on the rise, but also even just within your own party group. So he says, on populists in the EPP and more broadly, they are already among us, feeding on the weakness of traditional elites. You will find them in your ranks. They want to use it as an argument for an alternative, illiberal version of democracy. I mean, how much of your time do you spend sort of strategizing or dealing with or countering this sort of sense that there are simple answers and that if we just lock people out or put up a wall, that somehow the world will get better for Europe?
Yeah, this is my favorite topic. Thanks for asking. In the previous world, or in old normal, many political parties promised too much before the elections. But once they got into power, the common sense suddenly appeared, and they did not do everything what was promised. It was very bad for the voters. But the new normal is that there are more and more political groups who are promising too much, even silly things, and the new normal is that they are implementing those after the elections. So you could say that the consumer protection is better now, but people are suffering more. So there are several reasons where the populism is rising from, but if you see a difficult problem, there is not usually an easy solution. In most of the societies, easy solutions have already been done. There's only difficult solutions left. So in old normal, the axis between right and left was the most significant one. Now it has been replaced by responsibles and irresponsibles. So the populists and responsibles are the two extreme axes in the politics today, and this is more relevant than the axis between left and right. So there are some examples in some of our member states where populist Populist Party has challenged the traditional established political movements, parties. And those who find the situation very difficult in the responsible side, they have started to flirt with the populism. What has been the outcome? They have always lost, because you can never be better, more genuine populist than the populists themselves. And if you give an impression that I used to be responsible, but now I'm responsible, but also a bit populist, you lose your credibility.
Yeah.
So, movement from right to the center is acceptable, or from left to the center. But moving from responsible political spectrum towards populism, it's not acceptable. It's as clear. This is like a black and white issue. I'm a consensus builder. I've been forced to make compromises in my previous life. I led a coalition government in which we had 6 parties. And that's why I rarely believe in black and white issues. But this division between populism and responsible political forces, it's a black and white question. You cannot play with these kind of games. So this populism seems to be a common disease in all the Western world. Look at the American elections, for instance, or various European countries. So we are dealing. This is a issue of our time.
Yep.
We
well,
cannot.
Maybe that puts the Juncker Commission in a new light. I'm just thinking out loud now, but we hear again and again that this has to be a more political commission. Even the appointment of commission heads of representation, they're now political representatives of the president. We were hearing earlier this week, or so late last week. So in a sense, could we see the Juncker Commission as a kind of coalition of the responsible? Is that what they mean?
Yes, I very much agree with this idea. I very much like what Jean-Claude Juncker has wanted to do to the Commission. To be more political means that we don't pretend to be kind of people who does not have any societal opinions. We are not just a persons who doesn't have any opinions or who doesn't have a internal flame to change the world. Every single commissioner is in the commission because he or she has a internal flame to change the world. And if you have this flame, then you are a politician. If you are a regulator, and if you are doing conscious choices between the values, you are a politician. And it's supposed to mean that we are closer to people.
Yep. Well, I was thinking maybe we can get onto one of your favorite topics now, the Juncker investment plan. I think off the bat, I can say it seems like a quite smart choice. You've sort of glued yourself to the president. You've focused not solely, but you've really honed in on one thing to deliver rather than having 100 different priorities. And so I want to get a sense of where we're at with that plan. And one of the first things, or one of the elements of skepticism that people bring to your plan is they hear the numbers about we're going to put in 15 or 20 billion and then magically 300 billion will come out. So tell us why that's not a fairy tale. Why do those numbers stack up?
It was a very good idea from Jean-Claude Juncker to concentrate on 10 priorities instead of covering the whole world. Because he, as a former prime minister and former president of the Eurogroup, knows that we have to focus to something which has the biggest relevance for Europe, in order to get our messages through, in order to deliver concrete results. So the investment plan for Europe, and especially when talking about EFSI, the European Fund for Strategic Investment, it's basically same as whatever banking. You have a capital base which will be leveraged by financial sector and in this time by private investors. So far we have 54 concrete projects in 22 member states. We have used 7.6 billion European guarantees for those 54 projects. And addition to this, we have already 150 agreement between the banks and EFSI on SME financing. 120,000 European SMEs will get financing because of this arrangement. And these two elements together, 54 projects plus 150 bank agreements, will trigger around 76 billion real investment. 80% of the money out of 76 billion will come from private sector. So we use public resources in order to cover part of the private investors' risk. And this will mobilize, crowd in private money, because Europe is full of liquidity. Yeah. We are not lacking liquidity. Banks are full of liquidity. Companies are quite wealthy, but they are lacking risk financing, and this is exactly what EFSI is offering.
That brings me to one of the questions from Twitter from Ronnie Patz, where I think you've almost answered it, where he asked, is it really new money that was previously parked somewhere else, I don't know, in Switzerland or under the bed, or is it money that's just been shifted from one column to another on a national balance sheet? Well, you're saying it's new money.
Yeah. 80% of this 76 billion, which I mentioned, is money which has been peacefully resting in the bank accounts, which has been there somewhere. It hasn't been newly created, but it has not found its way to useful concrete projects. So this is our idea. Our idea is to avoid raising public debt, instead mobilizing private money which is already into market.
Yep. And so you're roughly on track then in getting towards the 315
yes.
billion by the end of the mandate.
Yeah.
But are you satisfied with exactly how the money has been raised? Because the impression I get is that it's not all being put into a pool for sort of completely objective cross-border distribution. You've been rather more successful at getting national governments to sort of make a contribution, but they've essentially said, let's ring-fence it into our own backyard. Is that how it's really working out? And how do you feel about that sort of national ring-fencing tendency?
Yeah, the positive thing is that SME financing seems to fly very fast. There seems to be demand everywhere in Europe for instance, venture capital for financing innovative projects, R&D operations, etc. Also, renewable energy efficiency investments are very, very positive. Some digital investments are also very positive. But you are right, we are lacking, or not lacking, but there is not sufficient amount of cross-border investments in energy grids, for instance, or in some other areas. We need, and this is our everyday job, we try to promote the ways how companies could invest cross-border, or governments could, together with private sector, could invest cross-border, because there's a need for European-wide infrastructure projects. Maybe one additional point, this is that, as I said, there are 54 projects in 22 countries. So there are a few countries which have not yet benefited from EFSI. We are working on this. There are a few countries in which the awareness of the opportunities is not in the sufficient level, or then the administration capacity is lower than in some other countries. So we are working on helping member states to see the opportunities and to use EFSI. There will be one positive news very soon.
Oh, you can tell us now.
I think it's not public yet. No. Okay. So it's it will come very, very soon.
And did those national governments give you any particular reasons? I mean, so on the positive side, I joined you on a visit to the UK last year, and you got 8 billion out of the UK. And I sat there and thought, wow, I mean, anyone who can get 8 billion out of the UK clearly has some kind of magic formula for getting a somewhat skeptical administration to engage with your project. But at the same time, the other governments must have been giving you some reasons for why they weren't going to just sort of write you a check and let you distribute it across borders.
Yeah, mostly it's because of political priorities of the country. In UK, By the way, UK is the fourth biggest beneficiary of FC. There are, if I remember right, 7 agreements between British banks and FC on SME financing, and 7 other projects which have got partially financing from FC. UK is doing very well, and the UK government's priority it was the same as in Germany, in Poland, in France, in Italy, in all the countries which wanted to dedicate some particular resources for riskier, future-oriented investments. So they have not the countries which have not dedicated or which did not dedicate any particular resources for FC projects, they didn't have any experience, any explanations, but you can clearly see that in some countries they prioritize investments much more than in some other cases.
Yeah. And then sort of moving down one level to the regional level now, and another question that comes in from Twitter from Sylvain Metzer. She's asking, can the investment plan help bridge some of those divides that have been opening up across Europe? So whether it's north-south, the long-standing east-west divide, and to some extent I was also getting feedback online about sort of inclusive growth. So I mean, that's a little bit harder to tackle, but making sure that people aren't getting alienated in a way that sort of leaves them without a job for their whole lives or wanting to bomb somebody. So there's really big divides that are opening up. Can this sort of instrument help close those divides?
Yeah, it's first of all I have to say that FC is demand-driven fund. I mean, there must be a company or public entity who decide that we will invest in this and this and that, and they try to collect financing for the investment, but for some reason, the risk profile or for some other reasons, they cannot collect all the money from private sector. Then the project promoter turns to us or to EIB to ask risk financing. So Commission does not select the projects, but it's FC. So there must be a project promoter, either public or private, who decides to use FC. But the division between or difference between East and West and South and North, it's very important for us. We are advising very concrete manner some of our member states which have not been using FC so far in order to bring the gap a bit smaller. For instance, a good example, very positive example, Bulgaria is one of the countries which have used FC most for small and medium-sized business financing, whereas Romania has not any contracts between the banks and FC on SME financing. I have met, and my staff has met Romanian authorities and private sector people several times, and we have explained, look at your neighboring country, what they have done, you could do the same. You should pass a message to your banks, because it's the fastest way to stimulate Romanian economy is to let SMEs to invest. So we are doing this. Also in Cyprus and in Greece, we are working very closely with the private sector, but also with public authorities to find the opportunities. So it's very important. On inclusive growth, in this front, there is not that much demand so far, but we already have some good examples of investments to social infrastructure. For instance, in Ireland, there was a PPP, public-private partnership projects on healthcare centers. So FC participated to the projects which financed 22 or 21 primary healthcare centers. There are also other examples of this kind. But to be honest, most of the projects are in research, R&D side, innovation side, in energy sector, in digital, in transport sector.
Yep. And I noticed that you had another announcement last month, or I think you'd even previewed it at the end of last year. And that seemed to be really sort of joining up one or two or more funding streams, so the regional structural funds,
yes,
for example, into FC. So how is that working? And is that a trend that we're going to see more of?
Certainly, because our aim is to use structural funds more as a financial instrument, because it's the way to leverage the firepower. And in some countries, or in most of the countries, when talking about EU money, it has a very strong perception of grant, money coming from Brussels to my bank account, and I can use it for a way I find it the best. So, but now, if looking at another mindset, if it focused more on results, how many jobs, for instance, I can get by using EU support. The most efficient way is not always to use grants. Instead, you could use the same amount of money as a financial instrument, or use it as a capital base for leveraging it to financial instruments for SMEs. There are a few countries already who have dedicated a little bit amount of their structural funds for SME financing. So they have made a choice whether to use 10 million euros as a grant, which value is 10 million euros, or use 10 million euros as a financial instruments, which basically means that you can leverage it 10 times. So there are 100 million for SMEs.
And I noticed Commissioner Cretu was saying we need to use more of these financing instruments. And that is, I mean, to me that seems like a big shift in mindset, because if you look at the overall EU budget, the regional structural funds are now the biggest part of the budget. So are we moving to a situation post-2020 where that's really going to be a big realignment of the budget, where you're going to see more of this leveraging and less of this one-for-one euro grants?
I hope so, and at least right at the moment when we are discussing about the MFF review and the new budget, there's quite a strong commitment within the Commission to increase the amount of financial instrument, because its impact to the real economy, to job creation, it's much better than use money only as a grant. I don't say that grants will finish. To be realistic, the most of the EU money or structural fund regional money will be used as a grants also in the future, but hopefully the bigger share will be used as a financial instrument.
Excellent. Well, we're getting to the point where we need to bring in some audience questions, but I've got a couple of rapid-fire questions before then, and so this is the lighter side of things. And then the way we'll do this is I will say a word or a phrase, and you have to tell me your first reaction, the first thought in your head. So, I say Donald Trump, you say...
New normal.
I say full marathon, you say...
9.
He's done 9 marathons, that's what he's saying. I say gin and tonic, you say...
Napue.
I say austerity, you say...
Structural reforms.
Excellent. Well, I think it's about time to bring in some of your questions now. We've got a question up the front here, and then we've got a lot of men putting their hands up. So I've noted these ones, and you at the back. Are there any women who have a question? Aha! So we'll go to this gentleman here, and then the lady at the back, and then we'll come back to these guys.
Hello, I'm Giorgio Carotti. I'm working in a commission in the research department where I'm responsible for investing 1 billion a year in research projects on health. 200 million of these 1 billion were stolen. That's why our constituency feels it to fund EFSI. If we look at the projects which have been invested in health, you've mentioned one, the Irish hospital, there's only 2 others. If you look at the sectors, as you said, it is focusing on, let's say, the traditional types of investment, energy, transport, IT, of governments. What should I say to my constituency when I go back and try to demonstrate that their money is also addressing health? You're not choosing sectors, yet there are some sectors which are chosen and others which are not.
Yeah, it's. I wouldn't use the word that your money was stolen, because if you look at the projects, they are not a typical public sector investment project, because EFSI can be used only if there is private sector involvement. As I said, 80% of 76 billion comes from private sector. I don't know, I don't remember exact figure, but if I say that 70% of all the projects have a strong innovation angle, research and innovation angle. But you are right, there's not enough health-related innovation projects. But there's no reason why they could not be. We have already seen, for instance, in Spain, good projects. If I remember right, it concentrates on R&D of Alzheimer's disease. So this is one of our everyday work to pass a message to the private sector, but also to other public sector research centers that if there's a need this kind of risk financing, there's plenty of opportunities at the moment. So I'm quite satisfied that in a way R&D and I sector has managed to either directly or indirectly has managed to use EFSI quite well. But we have to cooperate on this specific issue on health research sector and pass together a message to, especially to private companies, on the new opportunities.
Oh, hang on.
Hello?
No. We've got one more coming to you. Sorry about that. I'd ask you to shout, but with the live stream, it won't work.
Hello? Yeah. Good morning, it's Daniela Abreu from Sustainopolis. You mentioned PPPs, public-private partnerships. Do you think this is the way forward for sustainable growth in Europe? And if yes, how do we better communicate this to the private sector? Because PPP has kind of a bad name sometimes. And also to cities and local authorities who could, in my opinion, be tapping much more from this type of agreement and partnership into EU funds.
Yeah. When I was a finance minister of Finland, I was opposing PPP projects because my fellow ministers were almost every week proposing a new PPP project. And I was saying it was the way to avoid budgetary ceilings. So this is my background. But since that, I have grown up, and I tend to think that let's look at PPP projects in a very pragmatic manner. There are very good examples of PPP projects, and there are very bad examples of them. So many times, if you organize PPP project intelligently, which is fair for both parties, you can invest in future and get results faster. And sometimes the projects are more efficiently managed than if you do it traditional way. So that is one of the reasons, or one of the reasons is for organizing or establishing European Investment Advisory Hub, is that we would like to help public authorities and also private investors to organize PPP projects. We have a lot of competence and knowledge on PPP projects in the Commission and also in the European Investment Bank. And we are the Advisory Hub, which is up and running, which is doing quite a good job actually at the moment, is there ready to help private and public project promoters to look at the best practices how to organize PPP structures. So I'm very pragmatic towards PPP structure. It can function extremely well. They can be extremely efficient. But of course, the policymakers must always take care that they don't front load or overload the next generation's liabilities. You have to use PPP structure in a very responsible manner.
Mm-hmm. We had two gentlemen here. So yes, sorry, you first, sir, then Stefano, and then at the microphone. Yes, please. Yep.
Stasinopoulos, formerly with the European Commission, on the issue of structural reforms. I mean, in Europe, we thought Finland is a model of sound governance and responsible use of debt. On that question that was asked, you said there is a need for more reforms. The question is there is a need for more reforms, or do you have any feeling that some of the reforms that we pushed, they were not the right ones for every country? Mm-hmm. The initial emphasis on, let's say, supply side reforms, cost cutting, and in some cases did not work because we have been unable to turn around the debt dynamics. Recently, I was surprised by the statement of the OECD statement that we need pro-growth structural policies to boost demand. So how do you feel in terms of the direction of structural policies? For me, it's not always the issue more or less, but a slight, let's say, adjustment on that.
Yeah, structural reforms can be very, or there can be very different kind of structural reforms. Many times people tend to think that structural reform means lowering salaries. This is not what I mean. As I said, to me, structural reform in some country can mean to raise the quality of principal education. Or in some countries, it's to merge higher education institutions in order to save money for the research instead of the walls. In some countries, it can mean opening up new markets or opening up the opening hours of the shops. In some countries, it may mean labor market reforms, like what we have seen happening in Italy. The current government is doing exactly the right job for reforming the Italian labor market in order to give better chances for young people to enter the labor market. In some countries, reform can mean hiring or reforming the pension system, because the life expectancy is 20 years more than when the pension system was created. So reforms usually have very bad reputation. Mm-hmm. But I mean, if we had not reformed our societies during the last 100 years, the Europe would be totally different. We have reformed, but now we have to reform again. And just, I sometimes thought that, how about if we listed 20 best practices from various areas of society from Europe, and so that, okay, look at this education structure, look at this university structure, look at this labor market, look at this pension system, look at this taxation, look at these incentives for entrepreneurs, look at these commodity market structures. And we all copy the best practices. Of course, I know that you cannot copy everything. But if we did something like this, Europe would be much wealthier, much socially just than it is at the moment.
Great. We've got, there's already 3 people on the list, and I think we might even have to make it quick questions and quick answers to get through them. So Stefano next, then you, sir, and then the man in the glasses, midway back.
Thank you, Commissioner Katainen. You beat me by 5. But 300. Let me go back to your first point, regulatory obstacles, which means red tape. Thank you. Do you honestly assess the EU impact, the EU as a whole, including the EU Parliament, as cutting red tape or adding an extra layer of red tape, an extra layer which very often runs against the principle of subsidiarity, in the sense that tries to have the same regulation for different national situation or very specific regional circumstances. Thank you.
We have 3 levels on which we are working to do regulatory refit. Let's put it this way. The first one is creating new markets. Kind of a single market project is very important. The less we have national regulation, the more we have, or the more we can replace national regulations by European one, the less there is regulations, basically. If we can replace 28 national regulations by one European regulation, it's always better. So this is one way to think the regulatory obstacles or removing the regulatory obstacles. The second thing is that we have analyzed our member states from investment point of view more carefully than before. And we identified crucial regulatory obstacles in all 28 member states which are holding back investments. And we advised member states to remove those obstacles. So if they lift those obstacles, regulatory obstacles away, then investments have better and business have better operating environment in their countries. And the third element is our continuous refit process, which Vice President Timmermans is running. So we are looking at our existing regulations, whether they still functions as well as they're supposed to function, or should we somehow change the existing regulation. So I think that we can do quite a lot in this front, and I'm really satisfied and glad that our President Juncker wanted to highlight this regulatory issue so strongly, and it's one of his 10 priorities. So it's before the European elections, cutting red tape was very ideologized. Some people say that let's get rid of most of the EU regulations. The others said that you cannot do this, and it was not very reasonable discussion. But under Juncker's leadership, we have managed to find sustainable way to look at the regulatory issues, national, European, and then we check our existing rule base.
Mm-hmm. Oh yes, so we need a microphone up the front. Sorry.
Thank you. My name is James Cogan. I'm an industry analyst. Getting back to a point raised by Alessandro at the very opening of the event this morning, 5 times more VC activity in the US compared to the EU normalized. What would be your top 3 things to get us the multiply by 5 to catch up?
It's the average size of American venture capital fund is 260 million or something like this, 280 million, whereas the average European venture capital funds are around 60 million euros. And size really matters. The bigger the fund you have, the more efficient, conscious investment decisions you can make, and the better risk-bearing capacity the fund has. So, the latest issue, which has not done yet, but which will be published officially by June, is the new European Venture Capital Fund of Funds. Our aim is to use existing financial instruments we have in the European budget for collecting the money together, and half of the money will come from private sector. So the size of the new fund of funds will be around 500 million. This is our target. 50% from public sector, 50% from private sector. Right at the moment we are looking at the design whether there should be some sort of incentives for private investors to invest in the funds. And this fund of fund can then invest in the other existing venture capital funds. This is just one example. Then the capital market union as a whole is supposed to change the capital market environment in Europe, which hopefully will have a positive impact to venture capital activities.
Great. Now we'll quickly take this last question here, the gentleman on the audience left. Yep.
Good morning, Ignacy Guardans from Colonel Gates. Startups, so small enterprises initiatives, that's an essential element for competitiveness and something which makes a big distinction between us and the US. There's a lot of talk about that, langue de bois, as they say in French, but what is your priority on startups? Is it access to funding? Is it regulatory? Is it not a priority? What is exactly on your agenda in terms of startups as an essential element for competitiveness in Europe?
In 1 minute or less.
Yeah, I think the main issue for startups is to create better European-wide market, the access to market. Some people are saying that there is not lack of startup financing. I tend to disagree a bit, especially when looking at venture capital funding. Situation is different here than it is in the United States. So I would say that we have to look at the funding side too, but the most important thing is to have a European-wide market.
Great. Well, I'm going to throw one very quick question in because I think we've seen it over the last 2 days and we're going to see it for many more days to come, this leak of the Panama Papers on the tax issue. Now, you're not directly responsible, but I know your colleague Margaret Vestager said this is going to be the tip of the iceberg. The journalists are promising that it's the tip of the iceberg as well. Do you have any reactions to what you've been seeing or what might come?
I think my reaction is the same as many of my colleagues. I'm furious. It's totally unacceptable. The best thing in this issue is the leak. So it's not necessarily illegal to have a bank account in tax heaven, but if you are avoiding taxes, then it's totally unacceptable. I mean, it's against welfare society philosophy. It's strongly against about fairness. And it's totally against about fair market economy. So I hope that this will open up a bigger development. By the way, the European Commission has been very active on this front already. And I do hope that we get more tools also to our hands to tackle and address this cancer. I would call it as a cancer of market economy.
Well, you can't get clearer than that, folks. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I want to thank all of you for joining us and having the patience to stay with that extra 10 minutes that we just ran through there. I want to remind you to fill out those evaluation forms before you head out the front door and to let you know that our next event will be our first cocktails, at Playbook Cocktails on the 18th with Emmanuel Macron, the French economy minister. So thank you all and have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.